On the international stage, there hasn't been many things much more embarrassing than the UK's process of leaving the EU. The British voted in a tight referendum to leave the Union. The initial results were a shock to Europe and the world, and to this day, the consequences of this decision still continue. The process to separate from the EU is not easy. It has never been done in its history, so when the UK activated Article 50 of the Treaty of the European Union to withdraw from the Union, they triggered a 2-year countdown. The 2 years passed and Theresa May's government managed to weld an agreement with Brussels, though a very controversial one. The agreement itself consists of more than 500 pages, so forget about a summary. But in general, the agreement left the UK in a legal limbo. It would be outside of the Union in many aspects, but still kind of tied to it in others, especially regarding the immigration issue in Northern Ireland. The British always had a love-hate relationship with the European Union. The United Kingdom had always refrained from being too integrated within the Union. Here is a map of the population that says they feel European between 1995 and 2015. The British never adopted the euro, and it was never part of the Schengen Treaty, and the most conservative British politicians intended to end the free movement of immigrants, especially of the Romanians and other Eastern Europeans within the UK. But in the EU, this free movement is implicit. The dream of the most radical conservatives of the parliament is to end this free movement, and this was indeed one of the points in May's agreements in their separation from the Union. The problem is that the UK borders Ireland, so this creates a new border between Ireland, which belongs to the EU, and Northern Ireland, belonging to the UK. But to raise a physical border between the two Irelands would put the peace in this region into jeopardy. If you don't understand much of what's happening, don't worry. Neither the British themselves or their politicians know what's happening either. Today, we will try to explain Brexit, which is certain to happen at any moment, and what this could mean for the future. It must be stated, since Brexit is something affected by the vote, many changes can occur. So without further introduction, let's begin. March 29, the day of independence of the UK from the EU, was marked on the calendar for years as the day that London would cut their ties with Brussels, but it didn't happen. The British government, i.e. May, managed to seal an accord with Brussels, an agreement of more than 500 pages. But like any divorce, nothing is easy, and it's even worse if there are children involved. In this case, we could consider Ireland as the son of the marriage between the European Union and the United Kingdom. One of the most critical points of May's agreements is the Irish border. For many years, Northern Ireland and Ireland were in a civil conflict that claimed hundreds of lives and spawned a wave of violence decades ago. With the peace negotiated and subsequently the membership of the UK and Northern Ireland into the EU allowed the free movement of the Irish and the North through the whole island without limitations. The Irish border is the most critical point of the negotiations. It is precisely the issue of the Irish border within the agreement that has blocked the British Parliament from approving May's agreement. So how can the UK leave the customs union and free movement within Europe without re-establishing a physical border and customs control between Ireland and Northern Ireland? The matter has confused the heads of London and Brussels, since this would be the main border of the EU and the UK. But at the same time, separating the two islands would have a massive issue for the entire island. The United Kingdom had initially proposed a technological solution, such as an advanced customs and transport control system, but the proposal was rejected by EU officials and Ireland for being too unachievable. Initially, the EU proposed that North Ireland should remain in the single market and customs union, which triggered a furious response from London, because if this happens, Northern Ireland would still technically be in the EU within their policy. However, the rest of Britain would still be outside of the policies, and this would put up border control between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, isolating it from the rest of the UK. The EU then moved its position, that would be activated if future trade negotiations failed to avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland. Supporters of Brexit detest this for fear that it leaves the United Kingdom chained to EU standards. Some EU countries criticize the plan that allows one part of the UK to remain in the single market and for the rest to leave. As you can see, it's a complicated legal limbo, which neither the British Parliament nor Brussels have any idea of how it will develop, but it was one of the most disputed points in the agreement. When the 27 countries of the EU Parliament approved the agreement, only lacking the approval of the British Parliament to proceed an orderly exit, guess what? The British Parliament did not reject it once, not twice, but 3 times in a row. What occurs may seem complicated, but in summary, the most radical and Eurosceptic faction of the Conservative Party will not accept that the UK can remain in the customs union, or worse, leave Northern Ireland and the unique market, since a future incident might cause the unification of the two Irelands in the case of a political conflict between Dublin and London. So for the first time that the agreement was voted on, more than 400 legislators rejected it, the worst defeat of any major government in power in the last few decades. Afterwards, there was an attempt to politically overthrow May as party leader, and she even suffered defections within her own party. The UK government seems to be continuously imploding. The Labour Party, the opposition of the Conservative Party, which favours the permanence of the UK in the EU, which is a centre-left party led by Jeremy Corbyn, has become a stone in the shoe of the Parliament, opposing to support the agreement, only to see London suffer in anarchy and chaos. And that is because the agreement is as close to the EU as the Labour Party could accept, since a Brexit without an agreement is not something that neither the Labour Party nor the majority of the Conservatives want. In many legal aspects that are impossible to treat within this one video, the May Agreement leaves the UK with one foot still in the door of the Union. This is seen as something negative from the point of view of both parties, but especially for the Conservatives, where a good part of them would prefer that the UK would leave without an agreement with the EU. In other words, the British executive branch has reached an agreement with Europe, but the British legislature does not want to accept the agreement. Therefore, the British executive and legislative branch struggle to achieve a quick solution. Thus, the European Union is simply watching London bicker as the executive and legislative power comes to a conclusion. Many believe that the Labour Party, led by Corbyn, rather than trying to find a good agreement, is only trying to cause a constitutional crisis in London and forcefully impose the resignation of the British Prime Minister, leading to a call to election. Elections where the Labour Party may rise to power, or the Conservatives could remain in power with someone even more radical leading it. So seeing this disaster, May opted to extend the deadline of the agreement from the 29th of March to the 12th of April. But on April 10th, the European Union determined that the deadline would be extended until October 31st of 2019, Halloween night. This prolongation caused the UK to participate in the European elections in May, and therefore, the British will be called to the polls. If the British Parliament fails to approve May's agreement, and if no other agreement is found, France has already stated that the UK will then have to leave without any agreement by November. So what if the United Kingdom exits without an agreement? At first glance, this seems like a very likely scenario, but remember that the British Parliament voted against this option. Although this isn't legally binding. In fact, nothing is binding, not even the 2016 referendum. The UK could stop Brexit tomorrow and no law would have been broken, only the will of the ones who voted to leave. Theresa May had stated that the UK will not go without an agreement, stating that if the existing agreement is not approved, then it will be renegotiated. It's either leave with an agreement or Brexit is cancelled. In the event that all negotiations fail and patience of Brussels, Paris, and Berlin runs out, there would be no other option than to leave without any agreements. So what are the consequences? No one really knows for sure, but many economists and political scientists have made multiple models. According to the Bank of England, the UK would enter a recession with a decrease of up to 3% of the British GDP right after the exit. The pound sterling would depreciate enough that it could even be equal to the euro, which would cause an intense increase in inflation in Britain and would increase poverty levels. The British crisis would be equal to or worse than the American subprime crisis of 2008. A hard Brexit would greatly impact Belgium, Netherlands, France, Germany, and Luxembourg, and to a lesser extent, Spain, Italy, and Poland. Depending on the immediate impact of a hard Brexit in the Eurozone, the euro would depreciate against the dollar, aggravating the Italian recession. All imports from the UK would be subject to heavy taxes at customs. This is especially worrisome since more than 70% of what the British eat comes from the rest of the EU. Worst case scenario, the country can last for weeks without basic products, which has led people to collect canned foods and other basic necessities. There's even a rumor going around of a secret plan to evacuate the Queen in case of escalated protests in London. A British recession could drag the rest of the European countries into another recession as well, although this hasn't been a topic that is widely studied. In short, the UK's currency, the pound sterling, would depreciate, and therefore everything would become more expensive for the British. Even if their exports become cheaper, without any agreement, all their products that go into Europe will be charged with tariffs, unlike today, where there are no tariffs in place. Multiple airlines would have to stop operating in Europe if a part of the capital stock is not controlled in a majority by European Union capital. Thousands of flights could be cancelled, leaving millions of passengers stranded, including thousands of EU students in the UK or vice versa. The question of what would happen to EU citizens currently residing in the UK is also a subject of controversy. London has said that even in the case of a hard Brexit, they will respect the rights of the EU citizens still residing within the country. But to what extent will this be true? We still don't know. For the rest of European countries, it will depend on each government, but deportations cannot be ruled out, although this would be very unlikely. And if it does happen, the tension between London and Brussels will only further escalate. Another issue is Gibraltar, as this would become another border between the EU and Great Britain. So with so many negative effects, does anyone really win with a hard Brexit? Well, yes, several countries in fact, but mostly non-European countries. One of the great beneficiaries will be the US, since the product of a traumatic rupture between England and Europe will leave it no choice but to try and replace European imports with American imports. The same case would happen with China, which could supply the UK with technology replacing German and French imports. The United Kingdom could negotiate different trade agreements with different economic powers, which in the first instance would benefit countries such as the US, China, and Japan, while the British economy struggles with its recession. The way in which Brexit is conducted will also impact how the Union will be seen. If Brussels acts very docile, then other members will think that there is not much consequence in leaving the Union. But if they act tough, then other countries would think less about trying to leave the Union. Obviously, a hard or soft Brexit has its own advantages and disadvantages. It is not a simple issue, especially with the still very polarized opinion of the British people who are still divided. In the case of a hard Brexit, this could even imply the separation of Scotland from the UK, ending the current state of the kingdom, but that is already a subject for a follow-up video. In any case, this will not be the last video about Brexit, as there will be more news to come in the coming months or even years. So what do you think about Brexit? Do you think that the European Union is acting too docile or too tough on London? How do you think this circus will end? I hope you liked this video. Don't forget to leave your video suggestions in the comments below and like and subscribe for more content every single week. See you next time.